Welcome to the Rust Belt Rundown, brought to you by Rust Belt Recruiting. This podcast is designed to shine a light on the meaningful work being done in Northeast Ohio and the surrounding region. We will convene manufacturing executives and Northeast Ohio business leaders for candid discussions about their business, regional happenings, industry trends, entrepreneurship, and more. Now, let's get running on the rundown.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 28 of the Rust Belt Rundown, a Rust Belt recruiting production. I am your host, Paul O'Connor, and we're super excited to be kicking off 2022 with Jacob Duritsky, the Vice President of Strategy and Research at Team Neo. Jacob, welcome to the Rundown, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
So we've had a colleague of yours from Team Neo on earlier last year. I think most people listening to this are familiar with Team Neo, but tell us, what's one thing that your organization does for the community that people or businesses may not be aware of?
Yeah, so it's always hard to narrow it down to one, but I'll put it into two buckets if that's okay.
Yeah.
The first is we're really here to help businesses grow. When you think about the role that we play in the community, what we try to do is all about helping businesses grow and thrive in Northeast Ohio. So if you're a company that's here today, if you're a company that's outside of the market, that's maybe thinking about making a new investment, we're here to provide resources, and that can be incentives, that can be data. It can be a lot of different things that can help companies make investments. Northeast Ohio is a great place to do business. But sort of complementary to that, we're also thinking about strategic initiatives that can help sort of companies thrive in Northeast Ohio's economic environment. So think about things like talent or site development, or even when we think about the future of technology and manufacturing 4.0, very much developing strategies to help align around those and help companies understand the role that they play and the role that we can assist in helping about those things.
Got it. You mentioned the labor force and talent. We're going to talk about that a ton this episode. So let's jump into that. Obviously, much has been said about the labor force over the past few years. What challenges does Cleveland specifically face within the labor force in 2022? And then what are kind of some, like you mentioned, initiatives or strategies that Team Neo is doing to help?
Yeah, absolutely. So to this, not to give listeners a history lesson, because no one wants that, but
that's what we want. That's what we want.
Okay, well, okay. So I'm gonna a couple of decades actually, and a part of the challenge that we face as Northeast Ohio overall is that we have faced over the past, call it 30 years or so, overall declining population. Now it's mild, we're not losing people in huge chunks, but we are seeing declines, declining labor force, a declining and aging workforce as well. And it's particularly acute in sectors like manufacturing, which matter a great deal here still. So one of the things, talent strategies we have to recognize, I think, is it's critical that we're not going to grow our way out of this, right? And that we have to think about alignment here in the most in-demand sectors of the economy. For us, that means things like healthcare, manufacturing, IT, where we see in any given year 50 to 55,000 jobs going unfilled. So to think about it from a sort of a level setting perspective, we've had issues that we've dealt with now for a couple of decades that we can't just simply change overnight. What that means is connecting more people here to more opportunities in the community. So how do I sort of expand on that? Well, what we've seen is that over the past 5 years, those three key areas, manufacturing, healthcare, and IT, in that gap have been disproportionately underrepresented by communities of color and women. So what we need to think about more is how do we connect everyone to opportunities in the community? And how do we think about alignment within the workforce that we have here today? And that's going to be critically important. You asked a question about what we're doing about it. And there are a few things that we're trying to do. One is, I think, the basis for a big portion of this conversation. We try to inform the way the community thinks about it. We put out a series of reports annually, one called Aligning Opportunities, which looks at the supply-demand mismatch between what businesses need and the credentials we're producing. one called misaligned opportunities, which looks at that through an eye of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then one called lost opportunities, which looks at that with an eye toward gender. And a big portion of what we think we can do in the talent space and our team can do at Team Neo is inform that conversation and give people a common way to think about the problem. And I think that becomes incredibly important as you think about strategy alignment and how we all think about our partners, thinking about these in a consistent way. And I would say the good news is over the past 5 or 6 years that we've been doing that, people have gravitated toward a common way to think about the definition of the problem. The second is, given what we do in our role regionally, is trying to get people to think more about sort of the regional talent ecosystem and how it all syncs together. I'll give you a very practical example, but day to day, we work with a lot of companies. And if a company comes to us and says, hey, I need 200 software developers in the next 3 years, can you produce them? And they're only looking at Cuyahoga County or Geauga County or Lake County. It's not necessarily demonstrating that we have the talent pool that's accessible in a way that can build the talent that they need over time. So selling the 18 counties, the 25 colleges and universities, the entire talent ecosystem through our Talent Development Council effort, which is bringing together higher education, business partnership, as well as sector partnerships to have a common conversation about what we do to drive solutions. And then, I would say the last two things are one, Team Neo is the Jobs Ohio partner for Northeast Ohio. So Jobs Ohio, for folks who might not be familiar, represents the state in terms of economic development, very unique privatized economic development system. We're their partner here in Northeast Ohio. They offer, tax credits, grants, consulting services for companies looking to take on training. And then we're trying to partner with folks locally here. So Junior Achievement, College Now, Youth Opportunities Unlimited, to take all this messaging, which admittedly can be a little academic and maybe a little focused toward business and higher education, and think about how we spread that towards 6th through 12th graders through, teachers and administrators of young people, and really starting to think about connecting with people at a very, very earlier point in time to make impact in some of these areas.
So a lot to break down there. I wanted to touch on the point. So you mentioned you're not going to grow your way out of it, right? You've seen declining population over the last few decades. I think I remember looking at the census data for Ohio, and I think Columbus was the only in the last 10 years. I think Columbus was the only one that showed a positive population growth in the entire, maybe Cincinnati too. I can't remember, but there wasn't many. So it's not just a Cleveland issue. But I guess my question is, it may not even be a question, more of a statement, like your jobs are even that much more important, because if you're not necessarily able to grow your way out of it, like a city like Miami or Austin is, where people all of a sudden are in these cold climates, paying a lot of money for these things, they say, you know what, I'm leaving California, I'm leaving New York, I'm going somewhere warmer. And so those cities could just grow quickly. So if Cleveland doesn't have that, it almost puts even more emphasis on what you guys do, because it seems as if you need to attract younger people by jobs and businesses. So people will move to Cleveland if there's a new Google factory or there's a new, XYZ. Am I thinking about that the right way?
Yeah, Paul, you're absolutely thinking about it the right way. That's sort of where the phrase, we can't grow our way out of this, comes from. And you're absolutely right. When you think about us compared to a market like Columbus has very, very different sort of population dynamics that they're dealing with. And so you have an element of growth by inertia, right? You just have more people entering the labor force in the market over time. We don't have that. We actually have a bit of the opposite, which is people leaving in some element of it. So it becomes, how do we think about the people who are here today? But also, how do we think about keeping more of the people who come here for reasons like higher education, right? When you think about our student population base, we keep about 47% of the students who go to school here in Northeast Ohio, which actually, compared to some of our peer metros, think about a Chicago or a Pittsburgh or a Columbus even, isn't that bad from a percentage standpoint. But how do we offer them opportunities to show that while they're here, Northeast Ohio is an attractive place to stay, to start a career, to start a family? And I think that's all part of the pitch that we have to make. And I think that's what's fundamentally a part of what we're trying to do differently, is when we think about talent pools, it's not just, worker job. It's now, well, what about that adult learner who stopped out of school, right? And how do we connect them back to an opportunity? It's that student who's here and we have them captive for 2 to 4 years. Okay, so how do we think about keeping them here and selling them on Northeast Ohio? And then it's sort of that longer term question about how do we think about talent attraction? How do we think about bringing people back into the market? I'll give you one example of that that is relevant to something that's coming up this year. In fact, in the next couple of months, we've been closely with Destination Cleveland, who does a lot of the travel tourism work Ohio, on a conference that they're focused on, which is looking at women in cybersecurity. So we have somewhere from 800 to 900 young students, all women, coming here who are all majoring in cybersecurity. How do we take advantage of that and say, hey, Northeast Ohio is a place that needs your skills, that needs your talent, and also give them an opportunity to understand that this isn't just, somewhere to come and attend a conference for 3 days, but sell them on all the possibilities that Northeast Ohio gives them for what it is that we need. And in return, hopefully attract a talented pool of candidates here that can help drive the economy forward.
So you said was it 47% of,
Yep.
okay. So
Yep.
I got to imagine that, you're not, of course, would you want it to be 80%? Yeah, of course. But what is the difference between getting it from 47 to like 54? The long-term effects on the city must be profound, and that's probably, I don't want to say probably, but that's probably a realistic goal and where you're trying to get, right? Because that's thousands of students that stay.
That's absolutely right. So we did, if you just think about, just for simple math purposes, 47, let's go to 57%. We would keep an additional 2,500 educated bachelor's plus students here in Northeast Ohio in any given year. And so think about the sort of compounding impact of that over the course of a decade or so. You're talking potentially, 25,000 plus new bachelor's plus educated workers.
Yep.
Why is that so important? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, we know that some type of credentialing doesn't have to be a bachelor's, but it can be a certificate, an associate's, a bachelor's degree, or even higher, a graduate degree, is increasingly important to compete in the labor market. So that's growing in demand. But second is Northeast Ohio, frankly, compared to some of the markets that we look at, has struggled in that area particularly. So thinking about growing and keeping that captive audience here, and I always hesitate to use the phrase captive audience, but I think in many ways that's what it is. You've got an audience of students and people who are here. Keeping them here could be highly influential to the way we think about the future of the economy, the way we think about the future of talent alignment and demand in the economy overall.
Yeah. And I think overall, one thing that Ohio continues to have on its side, and now look, there are challenges, of course, but affordable housing. You can move to Ohio. Like my wife and I moved from New York a year ago, and we were able to purchase a home in 6 months. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it was a tough time to buy a home, very competitive, prices were up, but still compared to the rest of the country and some of these larger markets, you can still do it. And I think that's super important in cities like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus, to make sure that there are options across the board, whether you're looking for a high-end home or your first starter home, to continue to attract that talent pool.
That's absolutely right. So one of the things that we sell when we go out and talk to companies, particularly companies that aren't in the market, is that cost of living element to what we do here. And I think, you said you came from New York, you probably got sticker shock, but your savings account probably looks a bit better today than it did 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a part of the value proposition that we offer. Is it's not just about supply chains and the industry base that we have here. All that's critical, but it's also about quality of life and how far you can stretch that dollar. And making sure that people have opportunities to connect into family sustaining wage jobs, jobs that pay a good wage. And there are a lot of those out there. And so I think at the core of a lot of what we're talking about is, how do we connect people to those opportunities? And then how do we take advantage of those assets that we have here in the community? And like you said, a lot of that for us becomes what we would call a business attraction or talent attraction opportunity. It's if you're a company who's operating in California or New York or Boston in a coastal area where the cost of living and the cost of doing business is significantly higher. certainly given everything that's happened over the past 18 to 24 months and the shift towards, much more of a virtual workforce, we have a value proposition to sell, which is you can do it a lot more inexpensively here without necessarily the costs that are associated with some of those markets.
Yep. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. In the limited time that the newly minted Bibb administration has been tabbed to lead the city, what has Team Neo's relationship looked like with them? So we'll start there. And then with Valerie McCall's international affairs function being eliminated in City Hall, how do you think Team Neo can help to fill that void?
Yeah, so two things. We've had early engagement with Mayor Bibb's administration. So we've met with him. I think what we would say is they're thinking a lot about strategy alignment. And for the work that we do in representing the region overall, we tend to go, but make no mistake, the city of Cleveland and the recognition of that is incredibly important in the work that we do. But we also see ourselves as sort of a patchwork of communities throughout Northeast Ohio. And what I think is critically important to having these types of conversations with public officials is making sure that we have good, strong strategy alignment so that what the city is doing aligns with the region and aligns with the state. And so we're all in sync. And so the city's not doing something that is counter to what we're doing, or any city is doing that's counter to what we're doing. And that we're aligned with the way Jobs Ohio is thinking about that, and the state of Ohio is thinking about that as well. So I would say, it's very, very early on in the Mayor Bibb's administration, but we've had great conversations with him so far, but also look forward to continuing to build out that network. And that's one of the things that we've actually focused on as one of our strategy priorities, is building a highly inclusive network that includes everybody, right? Because if you're a company and you're thinking about coming here from Chicago, right? And think about a very real example that happened several years ago. Nestle closed their frozen foods division in Chicago, decided to move to Northeast Ohio. They were looking at multiple places, multiple communities. And to the people making those decisions, there were a lot of factors that go into where they ultimately lived. It was Solon on the east side of Cleveland that they ended up going. But there are a lot of folks in contention, and making sure we have a system that's aligned to be able to respond to those opportunities, is incredibly important to us. So I would say that's takeaway one. To your second point about international work, we have had for several years now someone who's very, very much dedicated to FDI, foreign direct investment, and new international investment in the community. So one of the things that we've prioritized over time is how do we think about new international investment opportunity in Northeast Ohio? And I think what the pandemic has done has really shifted the way we're thinking about reshoring, onshoring opportunities. When you saw supply chain disruptions, for instance, personal protection equipment, PPE, was probably the most noticeable to most people. Couldn't find the hand sanitizer, couldn't find some of the elements that we needed to make it through that. But it stretches far beyond that to things like aluminum shortages and the challenges that we saw even in the food and beverage manufacturing industry and others. And we certainly see it in the chip industry, right? And as it relates to automobiles and other things. So we have an opportunity now with the work that we do to have a dedicated focus on attracting new international opportunities. And I think in a post-pandemic environment, that's only going to become more attractive to how we think about shoring up supply chains here locally.
I'm always, this is the question I've been looking forward to the most of this episode. But so your role has a major focus on data and research. So it's a two-part question. So every morning, do you wake up and check a dashboard, or are you checking very specific particular numbers that you're reviewing? And then, so that's part one. And then part two is, what data do you and your team review when a potential business is looking to move to Cleveland, which that's a tough question too.
Yeah. So internally, we have a dashboard that is focused on a few different things that we are very cognizant of on a daily basis. One, it's looking at our project pipeline. And the way we think about that is, who are the number of companies, opportunities that we have at any given point in time that we can influence to try to make investments here. And that number can range from, several dozen to several hundred, depending on the time of year, depending on when we're doing it. But we're looking at the opportunity, we're looking at the industry, we're looking at the needs of those companies. So highly, highly cognizant of who's in the pipeline, the companies that are exploring Northeast Ohio, and what we need to do to convert those deals. And we always have an eye toward deal making. And the way we tend to think about that from a project perspective is around jobs, payroll, and capital. So how many jobs potentially could be created? What would the new payroll be associated with that? So, are these good in terms of wages associated with those jobs? And then how do we think about capital investment? So, I'll give you an example of that. We saw a lot of investment in the Mahoning Valley area around some of the shale opportunities there. Not a lot of jobs, but very, very heavy capital investment, multi-billion-dollar capital investment opportunities, which are also great for the community because of the multiplier impact that they have. And they bring in new jobs and new supply chain and new opportunity from other places. So I would say consistently, when we think about sort of the daily dashboard that Team NEO overall, not just the research team, thinks about, those are the key factors that we're looking at from a day-to-day perspective. When we think about the research team work that we do, we're sort of focused on the very short term, what companies need to make investment decisions. So it's thinking about demographics, it's thinking about labor force, it's higher education pools, it's wages, it's supply chain opportunities. It's anything a company needs to make a smart investment decision here in Northeast Ohio, but also very much focused throughout the year on sort of those more strategic initiatives and those most strategic pillars that we can influence. So I talked about the talent ones. We also think about commercialization roadmaps and what we can do to influence the future of Industry 4.0. So we've looked at over the past 2.5 years, new strategies around the industrial Internet of Things, as well as additive manufacturing or 3D printing. They can really be transformative to our manufacturing base here overall. So it's, for us, sort of as a research team, it's trying to prioritize the day-to-day, which tends to be very data heavy, with also thinking about the strategic future of what we can do. And in fact, something we'll be rolling out in late February is a new mechanism we're developing to think about that, called the Vibrant Economy Index. And the Vibrant Economy Index is really intended to show the interdependence between so many things in Northeast Ohio, like talent, like equity, like innovation, like resiliency, and how all of those drive outcomes like GDP and employment and growth over time. So it's not just thinking about how are we doing from an outcome perspective, it's also starting to think about how are we doing in terms of those action items. We talked about, the some college piece of it versus the bachelor's plus attainment. We can influence that here. And so it's taking those elements and starting to think through a lens of strategy alignment, data alignment, and then sort of how we have, I call it sort of tongue in cheek, nerd nirvana, but how do we have cascading metrics? How do we think about what Summit's doing and Cuyahoga County is doing and Mahoning Valley is doing? How do they all add up in a way that makes sense? And that we then know sort of our individual roles we can play in influencing those metrics over time.
Okay, so you mentioned the pipeline. What is the percentage breakdown of like inbound leads versus outbound prospecting? Like, are you guys going out and just sending out feelers to different companies saying, hey, look, this is what it would look like if you moved to Cleveland? Or are you is it more intake, inbound?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in a slightly different way, if that's okay. So we tend to think about it as in-region versus out-of-region companies that we contact. And we have people focused on both of those things. So if you think about in-region tends to be, so existing companies here looking to make an expansion. Think the new Sherwin-Williams headquarter deal, right? Those are about 80% of the projects that we touch, 80 to 85%. The attraction opportunities, bringing a new company in from outside the region, tend to be about 15 to 20% of what we touch. So we absolutely have people focused on outside the market who are going out, contacting people in those markets that are most important and selling the Northeast Ohio story. But a lot of the growth that we see does still tend to come from companies that are here in the region today. So a big priority for us is going out and calling on those most important companies. So we have a list that our team calls on in any given year that's over 1,000 companies that they touch base with to get a sense of how they're doing, how they're thinking about new investments potentially. We call it BRE, which stands for Business Retention Expansion Calls. But a strong majority still of the growth that we see comes from within the system here. And we do that honestly with the local partners that you alluded to, like the city of Cleveland, but also with partners like the Greater Cleveland Partnership, right? Who has very much a heavy corporate membership focus, but also has a heavy advocacy focus and can help advocate for new policies that companies need to make investments here. So, there's a lot of synergy that happens in the system, and a lot of it still takes place locally here.
So you would think organizations like Team Neo would have existed since the beginning of time, but you guys got your start in 2003. What did cities, specifically Cleveland, do before organizations like Team Neo existed to attract businesses? Was it just random?
So I wouldn't call it random necessarily, but I would say it was probably less aligned. Mm-hmm. And a part of the creation of Team Neo, to represent, I always use this data point because I think it's really interesting. Think about, we have an 18 county footprint. We have Cleveland, Akron, Canton, and Youngstown, so 4 relatively large metropolitan areas, all within about 90 minutes of one another. You don't see that in many places. And if you think about a drive from Cleveland to Akron, if you do it in rush hour, it's probably 40 to 45 minutes. If you do it speeding at 2:00 in the afternoon, it's probably 35 minutes. And that's geographically about the same distance from San Francisco to San Jose. I've done that drive. I've done it in rush hour. It takes about 2.5 hours. Yeah. So a part of the value proposition we have to sell is that we have so many proximate metros so close together. The challenge that brought with it historically is that companies didn't understand, a single point of entry. If they were sort of agnostic to whether they need to be in Cleveland or Akron or, Canton or Youngstown, and they were just kind of generally thinking about Northeast Ohio, they didn't want to navigate a lot of different areas. So part of Team Neo's was being a single point of entry so that we could then have those conversations with communities and understand where's the best place, where's the best prop. When, a company has very, very specific requests. They're asking, I need to be within 15 minutes of a major highway, or 10 minutes of a port, or 20 minutes of a freight line. So those are the types of questions very tactically that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So our sort of reason for being was to help streamline that process. But that said, a lot of our community partners, our county partners, still do a lot of important heavy lifting as it relates to things like business traction, going outside the market, making the case. What I would say is that over the past almost 20 years, at least since Team Neo's been formed, I keep getting back to this strategy alignment. We've seen such a high degree of alignment with our partners in the community. And that is so incredibly important, that we're consistent messaging, consistent way of thinking about calling, consistent way of thinking about the industries that matter most here. And that to me is, as we think about the next 5 to 10 years, important to our success overall.
How has Cleveland approached the changes we've seen in remote work? Specifically, how has this affected the commercial real estate in downtown areas? In Columbus, for example, we've seen a ton of office buildings getting transitioned to condos, which, I don't know if that's for better. I don't know yet. It kind of it shows that maybe businesses aren't coming back, but then it also shows, okay, well, we're investing in people to live down here, so there will be more businesses anyway. So what does it look like in Cleveland?
Yeah, so from a Cleveland market perspective, I think it's too early to sort of definitively say where that commercial office space is headed. Certainly seeing some conversion to apartments, condos, things like that, and certainly have seen a huge building boom as it relates to some of our urban areas, particularly in that space. And I would expect that trend to continue. The problem is that value proposition is very different. What a property owner gets from a company who's leasing a space versus a tenant who's leasing a space are sort of two different ways of thinking about usage. So I think we still have to figure that out. I think we're seeing, from early discussions with companies definitely thinking more about sort of permanent or semi-permanent remote environments. So I don't think that's going anywhere.
Yep.
But also companies thinking more strategically about where they should be located and how they think about location decisions. And so I'm pivoting on your question a bit because it's not just purely about commercial real estate, but I think there is a question to draw it back to the talent conversation that we started with, which is back to equity and diversity and how we include everyone in the labor force. We're having more and more conversations about where companies strategically need to think about being so they have accessible access. It's accessible access, probably not a great phrase. So they have access to a readily available workforce. So it's companies thinking differently about things like transit access, right? Are you on a bus line or a train line? Thinking differently about existing infrastructure. So, do you want to be in a greenfield, maybe in a exurban area, or do you want to be closer to some of your suppliers that you need very easy, readily accessible, approaches to? So I think the whole way that companies are thinking about making investment decisions is shifting overall. We work with a partner who's in the tech space, and one of the things that they've said is they went from a very suburban location to a urban location in just the outskirts of downtown Cleveland, and that they've seen their pool of minority candidates grow by 15 to 20% because of that, because they're along a transit route, because they have more walkability. So it's not just sort of the issue of what do we do with the existing. I think it's also how do companies now think differently about what investment decisions look like in a post-pandemic environment. And then I'll offer you sort of the other side to that that's a challenge. We also are dealing with, highly talented individuals here in Northeast Ohio who want to be here and who want to stay here, who are dealing with remote work environments being poached by companies, far and away from Northeast Ohio. So separate firm who had 2 people poached within the past 6 months or so from coastal firms who came in, offered them significantly more money. That coastal firm is still, saving dollars on what they would pay a local resident in San Francisco or Boston, but gaining a very qualified employee to do the job. We keep a resident, but the company is losing a worker. So I think that's going to be part of the dynamic we have to deal with too in kind of a post-pandemic environment as well, is how companies are thinking about sourcing talent. And, the other side to that is there's a huge rising wage component that we're seeing right now that some companies are struggling to deal with. I mean, nominal wages in sectors like leisure, hospitality, retail, you're talking 15 to 20% and up year over year gains in wages that folks are having to deal with. And while maybe your major corporations can take that hit and think about automation and technology, some of your smaller businesses are struggling to deal with that in the short term. So that's going to be an issue as well.
Okay, so you mentioned transit lines really quick. Are we going to get the Amtrak?
I don't know. Honestly,
I know.
I'm not sure what the future of that Amtrak proposal looks like. We tend not to be as directly involved in that. Groups like NOACA, who do more of the transportation planning, tend to be more involved in those conversations. As someone who personally, my wife and I moved to the west side of Cleveland on a street that has train access at the end of it to get us downtown. That was important to us. So, fingers crossed, I would say. More transit access to me is a good thing. But sure. I don't have any great insights into whether it's coming or not.
I was hoping we were going to be able to break some news this morning. Okay, last question. We'll get you out of here. We always just like to highlight some local Cleveland or just Northeast Ohio restaurants. So what's your favorite breakfast, lunch, dinner spot? Totally up to you. What's a good spot we need to visit?
Absolutely. So the one that would come to mind for a bunch of reasons would be Dante.
Okay, that's a new one.
Fremont. Yeah, Dante has been here he's a Michelin-starred chef out of New York, born and raised in Cleveland, traveled around the world, and opened Dante here probably 15 years ago. Also has Ohio's absolute best sushi spot in the basement called Ginkgo, which is attached to a Japanese style sushi restaurant. I say this saying Dante Bacuzzi, who is the head chef there, is a bit of a friend. But we have never had a bad meal there, and it's where we've celebrated most of our special occasions. And you can actually sit in the kitchen, have a meal, and do a 7, 14, or 21 course tasting. If you
21
want to,
is wild.
21 is wild. You better have several hours and a very empty stomach to do it. But yeah, that'd be my pick.
Wow. Awesome. Well, Jacob, listen, appreciate you coming on. This was great. We'll have you on again soon, I'm sure. And best of luck with everything in 2022. And yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity, and great chatting with you, and stay healthy and have a great 2022.
Yeah, you too. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Rust Belt Rundown. Make sure you check us out at rustbeltrecruiting.com. The Rust Belt Rundown is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and click on 5 stars if you enjoyed this episode. See you next time.